Hello everyone, welcome back to the Analyst for 16th of April 2024, where we will be trying to understand the most important articles from the Hindu and the Indian Express. Now the very first article for today is the India and the Arctic region. In the next one, we will be looking at the recent trends of welfare spending by the government of India. In the third article, we will be looking at the Andaman Nicobar Islands and how it is a very strategic location for India. In the fourth article, we will be looking at the concept of deemed forests in India, and finally in the last article, we will be looking at some of the data related to the external sector. And finally, to wrap up the session, we will be discussing some news in shorts, which we call it as prelims snippet, which will be aiding for your quick revision for the upcoming prelims examination. Students, in the very first article, we will be looking at India and the Arctic region, where according to the editorial, we have various important developments which is coming out from the Arctic region. And here, the context is that in March 2024, India's first winter experience at Arctic came to a successful end. Now here, this is a very important topic for our prelims with respect to Indian and world geography, where we'll be looking into the various aspects of the maps of Arctic region and also the various important applications in the geopolitical area. In the mains, we'll be looking into the various effects of the politics and economic aspects of the developed and the developing nations on India's interests. Now, we find that the Arctic region is always at the flashpoint of the global discourse, whether be it political, sustainability, that is environment, or economical. The Arctic region is always in the news, and this editorial is beautifully capturing each and every dimensions that we need to understand for our exam. Now see, if we look at this map here, we find that there are some countries located within the Arctic Circle. Now, for your effective revision, we can give it a name. The name is CURDFINS. For your effective revision, let this be a mnemonic where you can effectively try to recapture all the countries within the region. Starting with CURDFINS, C stands for Canada, US, Russia, Denmark, then Finland, Iceland, Norway, and Sweden. So in this way, you can understand, you can remember all the countries, and these are the countries which are located within the Arctic Circle. And also we understand that climate change is on the rise, and that is why we find that due to climate change, the impacts that it will have on the Arctic and the Antarctic regions are very profound. And when we look at the Arctic region in isolation, we find that the melting ice is a very cause of concern. And here we find that the Arctic region in winters and also in summers around say 100 or even 50 years ago were actually filled with ice. But nowadays, especially during the winters and also during the summers, we find that the amount of ice which is present in the region is declining at a very rapid rate. And that is obviously a very sad news for the climate change aspect of the entire globe. Starting from the delayed monsoons in India, and also the various other atmospheric and oceanic events around the world, we find that the melting ice is directly and indirectly related to the extreme weather events that is taking place in the entire world. But the thing is that with the same thing, we find that there are new potentials and new opportunities. Now, the very first opportunity that the melting ice is that according to recent reports, it is said that by 2050, the entire Arctic region will be totally ice free due to the amount of global warming events that are happening in the recent times. Now, if this takes place, this will give an opportunity of new shipping routes. Now, let us understand this through a map. Now, imagine that there are various countries located on this region, such as Russia and China. Now, these countries obviously trades a lot of amount with the European nations. Traditionally, the route right now, the route that they have to take to export their goods and services to Europe is actually through this dotted blue line. That is, they have to cross over through the Red Sea, through the Suez Canal, and then through the Mediterranean Sea, and then reach Europe. But the thing is that if we look that at a particular point in time where the entire Arctic region is ice free, we find that these countries can easily take the route that is enshrined in this red dotted line. That is, we can understand it will be reducing the distance that traditionally the Suez Canal is taking the time to by around 8,000 kilometers. And this is a very significant event because we understand countries like China and Russia, they want to reduce the trading routes, and this will be the new Silk Route according to many experts in the global discourse. And we can understand that due to the melting of ice, this can be the very first opportunity. The second opportunity comes in the amount of resources which are present in the Arctic region. Again, let us come to our map. Now here, look at the region that is shown in this map. If you can see, these are the all kind of areas marked in red, which are sources of around many reserves of oil reserves, natural gas, and various other deep sea minerals too. If we look at various reports, Arctic region is accounting for around 13% of the undiscovered oil in the region, and also 30% of the undiscovered natural gas. So we can understand all the countries in this region, they will be definitely going for these resources once the ice completely melt away. And that is why we have to understand that this region, particularly the areas of the countries where they have up to the areas of their exclusive economic zone according to UNCLOS, so we can understand that they will be claiming these regions and be exploiting the coal and the various natural resources such as crude oil and natural gases there. And this can also be potentially a very important event in the next 20 to 35 years going forward. And according to the main central core of the Arctic Ocean, which is also known as the North Pole, these regions are actually governed by the International Seabed Authority. But again here, Russia claims that since they have an extended continental shelf, the areas marked in this particular figure, we find that Russia is also claiming these particular lands, and also these particular ocean areas and the main areas of the Arctic Ocean, they have huge resources, and these claims and counterclaims by various countries can potentially lead to various tensions going forward too. And that brings us to our next point, that is the geopolitical considerations, the strategic importance of the various resources that is present in the region, and also the countries which are present in the region. Note that the US and Russia is also present. Note that China is also aiming to reduce its route over the Suez Canal by embarking on a new Silk route over the Arctic Oceans. So we find that there are many geopolitical issues and many dimensions which are also engrossing this region too. Apart from this, there are many resources which the countries will also be tending to secure it. And finally, the military presence of particular nations like Russia, which has openly claimed that once the entire ice has melted, Russia will be definitely going there and tapping the resources, and if need may be, Russia will not shy away from using military control. Next, obviously the area is a very important aspect of scientific interest between the nations, because we find that all the impacts of climate change, directly and indirectly, can be traced away to the melting of ice in the world's two poles, that is the North Pole and the South Pole. Apart from that, India is also trying to understand how the two poles, glacier melting and the ice melting, is also linked to the third pole of the world, that is the Himalayas, where the glaciers are also melting. So to understand how the Himalayas glaciers melting can be stopped and reduced, we have to first understand how the Arctic ice is melting and how the various measures should be implemented to stabilize it. So we have the various climate change aspirations of the various countries to mitigate and also to study and research and develop on these particular areas too. Next, obviously, when we talk about international cooperation, we have the Arctic Council, which is consisted of these members, Kurd Finns. Do remember this mnemonic. It will be aiding you in your effective revision. Now, this council was founded in 1996, where it is an association of all the members who are in this Arctic Circle. Please note that Iceland is the area of the Iceland, the land area of the Iceland is not within the Arctic Circle, but the exclusive economic zone is within the Arctic Circle. Now, when we talk about India, we have to understand some important facts here. Now, India is no newcomer to the Arctic. India's Arctic mission is actually based on various layers. The very first point is about India's cooperation with the Arctic region, and particularly with the Arctic countries too. Next, we have to also look at how the melting ice is also impacting the Himalayas, and how we can also counterbalance the melting ice in the Himalayas too. Next, we also want to contribute to the efforts to enhance humankind's understanding of the Arctic region by effective research and development, and also strengthen the international efforts at combating climate change. And finally, to advance the study and the understanding of the Arctic region within India. Now, towards this aspect, India's chronological journey is enshrined in this slide here. And for your prelims, it is very, very important that you know each and every aspect of India's developments in the Arctic region. So, it starts in 1920 with the signing of the Svalbard Treaty in Paris. Note that Svalbard is located in the region of Norway, where we find that this is the area of Svalbard, right? In 2007, India's first research mission was sent to investigate the Arctic microbiology, atmospheric sciences and geology. In 2008, India became the only developing nation aside from China to set up Arctic research base. In 2013, India was granted an observer status by the Arctic Council. So India is not a permanent member, but India has an observer status to the Arctic Council. Next, in 2014, India commissioned a multi-censored mode observatory in Svalbard again. And in 2016, an atmospheric laboratory was also set up. And finally, in March 2024, India's first winter experience at the Arctic came to a successful end. And towards this, we have to look at the potential collaboration of India and the Arctic region nations, particularly when we talk about Arctic Council. Right now, the chairperson of the council is Norway, with whom India has very amount of good relations. And that is why we have to understand India's 6 pillars of the Arctic policy. It is very simple to understand. The first pillar is obviously with respect to science and research taking place in the Arctic region, which will be strengthening efforts of the global efforts related to climate change. Next, it is also about national capacity building, or building the capacities of various universities, schools and colleges in the country to focus in the Arctic region, and also equip them with the various research and development skills. Next, it is also important with respect to Indian pillars with respect to Arctic region. It is about governance and international cooperation with reference to various treaties and the organizations. Next, it is also about the transportation and connectivity that India has with the region and efforts to enhance the same. Next, with reference to economic and human development and finding the linkages between the climate change and the economic aspects of climate change, studying the Arctic Circle and the climate change impacts within the same is very important. And finally, the most important pillar here, it is the climate and environmental practices that the global country have to obey with respect to reduce the melting of ice and combat the climate change aspirations. Now here, we have to understand that India's relations with various nations, particularly Norway, will be coming in hand when we talk about this region. And also, when we talk about India getting an observer status in the Arctic Council, India is a very responsible stakeholder. That means the Arctic nations, the Arctic countries, they view India as a responsible stakeholder, because with the many Arctic countries, India has very high amount of collaborations ranging from waste management, pollution control with nations such as Denmark. We also have projects on renewable energy, green technology, blue economy with the regions and countries such as USA, Russia, Sweden and so on. Also, when we talk about connectivity, maritime transport, investment and infrastructure in the region, recently India also invested a large amounts of Indian rupees in the Russia's Far East region. That is also a very important part of development of the Russian region in the Arctic Circle. And also, when we talk about India's recent aspirations with reference to seabed mining and resource exploitation, right, India is also looking into the same. And please note that when China is also interested in this region via Silk Route, their own maritime Silk Route, and also when we talk about China's ambitions in the region, India cannot be left alone. And that is why India is also trying to enhance its image as a responsible stakeholder and hence collaborate in the region. And finally, when we talk about the geopolitical tensions, the Arctic region is a potential hotbed of future tensions taking place in the region. So we cannot ignore the amount of tensions that can take place between the US and the Russia and the various other nations that will be taking its hold and its foot in the Arctic, such as China. So with respect to that, India is also having a potential image of a country which is not seeking conflicts. So India can also play its role in the future world where it can be marred with geopolitical tensions, and India playing a very fruitful and constructive role. In the next article, we'll be looking at the various welfare spending trends in India over the last 20 years, and this article is beautifully highlighting the same. This is a very important topic for your UPSC prelims for economic and social development, and with reference to GS2, we have various welfare schemes for vulnerable sections of the population and how they performed over a period of time. Now students, we understand that India being a developing nation, it needs various amounts of welfare schemes for a large section of its population, majorly on these four parameters. Firstly, the main target of India and the democracy it leads to reduce the amount of poverty levels. And when we talk about poverty levels, it is very, very important for the government of the day, both the central and the state governments, to focus on this. Next, when we talk about the vulnerabilities that the people have with respect to the low incomes, with reference to the need for a safety net of the people, right? The people of the nation and the various classes and sections of the population, they need various safety nets, be it food, be it health, be it various nutrition parameters. The people need this kind of safety nets. Next, the nation also needs empowerment. When we talk about financial inclusion, when we talk about inclusive growth, it is actually not without the government schemes that it is possible. And finally, when we talk about the economic growth of the nation, it is primarily through the upliftment of the people. Through building the capabilities of the people, the government can ensure that the people can lead a decent and dignified quality of life that can lead to the economic growth of the nation too. And for this, there are many trademark governmental schemes. Firstly, when we talk about the public distribution system, that is the distribution of the rations, the food security aspirations between the people. And also the National Food Security Act of 2013, it is actually catered to promoting the food security imperative in the nation. Next, when we talk about giving jobs and employment to the people, we cannot forget the scheme of Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme, which gives around 100 days of unskilled paid work to the rural areas. Next, the Pradhan Mantri Jan Dhan Yojana is giving the people bank accounts and promoting the financial inclusion aspirations of the people. The next scheme, the Pradhan Mantri Ujjwala Yojana, is giving free LPG cylinders so that the people are not left out when we talk about the food security aspects, and also when we talk about reducing household air pollution deaths. Next, Ayushman Bharat National Health Protection Scheme is actually giving health insurance to a large chunk of the below poverty line sections of the population. And finally, the Pradhan Mantri Awas Yojana is actually giving affordable housing to lakhs and lakhs of the individuals. And here we find that these are some of the most important governmental schemes. Now, when we talk about this trend in the spending with respect to these schemes over the last 20 years, we are seeing some aspects. Now, for the purpose of this editorial, the author has divided the various schemes into UPA schemes and the NDA schemes. The UPA schemes, according to him, is food security, Manrega, mid-day meals, ICDS, PM Matru Vandana Yojana. This means that these schemes were started during the UPA times and is even nowadays continued. The NDA schemes is including Swachh Bharat Mission, PM Awas Yojana, PM Kisan, Jal Jeevan Mission and LPG subsidies. So these are the schemes which were introduced after 2014 when the India government came into place. And when we see and when we look at the schemes, the NDA schemes are at a lower level. The spending for the same is at a lower level than the UPA schemes. Even when we compare it to now, the NDA schemes are actually at a lower trajectory. When we combine the both of the schemes, we find that these schemes were peaked during the COVID crisis when the government gave more and more welfare subsidies to the people. And with reference to the other trends, we find that the welfare expenditure is low and it is stagnating. It was only during the COVID time when it exceeded around 3% of the GDP, but it has remained lower than that, and even now it is even lower than 3% of the GDP. So we understand that welfare schemes, where we can understand, can lead to economic empowerment, reduction in vulnerabilities of the people. It is in fact less than 3% of the GDP. Then the centre's share were reduced to 60% from 90% for various schemes, particularly after the 14th Finance Commission's increase in the devolution of the funds to the state governments. This is also one of the reasons for the reduction. Next, we find that the UPA schemes are declining, as also highlighted in this diagram, and especially those for children. If we compare the schemes, that is from 2014, it was around at 1.5% of the GDP, it has reduced to 1% of the GDP in 2018-19. Next, we are seeing a new welfareism, which is a term for governments allocating more and more private goods to the people, such as free toilets, LPG cylinders, water connections, free housing, affordable housing under PM Awas Yojana. Now these are actually indicating that the government is actually providing private goods to the people. While the thing is that these kind of provisions are linked to various eligibility criteria, these are not backed by laws. Now please note that the PDS schemes, the Manrega schemes, for these we have particular laws, right? We have the National Food Security Act of 2013, which guarantees rations for the people. We have the Manrega Act, which is also guaranteeing 100 days of work for the people. And these were the schemes which were started by the UPA government. And right now the recent schemes which is related on the private goods, these are actually the schemes which are continued under the NDA government. So we find for the NDA government schemes, the new schemes, we find that there are no legal entitlements. It is actually on the discretion of the government who and whom will be eligible for the same, according to the various criticism in the article here. Next, the author is also telling that according to the various delays which is taking place in the 2021 census, this is leading to the exclusion of many National Food Security Act beneficiaries. And this is very, very important because National Food Security Act beneficiaries actually pool their data from the latest census. And the number of beneficiaries in recent times has obviously increased since the population of the nation has also increased. So it is said that many beneficiaries, despite being eligible, are not being included because the census was not conducted. And finally, the government right now is more focusing on increasing amount of capital expenditure, that is building effective amount of roads, schools, colleges, airports, ports and so on, which is building the capital stock of the nation. Right? So that is also shifting some of the resources away from the welfare schemes to the capital projects. And for this, the state governments is serving as a very, very good amount of motivation. And it is a silver lining that the state government is stepping up the game, where the funds from the actually union is declining over a period of time. Now, the states ruled by the regional parties, particularly with reference to midday meal and the ICDS schemes, the union governments have not increased the cooking costs per capita or say per children when we talk about only this scheme. But with reference to even the poorer states like Bihar, Jharkhand, Odisha, they are even giving multiple amount of eggs per meal per child in the schools. So we find that even the poorer states are taking initiatives in this. Next, the central contribution to some social security pensions, particularly elderly widows, they have stagnated at 200 rupees per month from the center. And with reference to a state like Odisha, Odisha's Madhu Babu Pension Yojana, around 58% of the entire scheme is spent on the pensions, and it is sourced from the state government treasury. Next, we also find states like Odisha and Tamil Nadu, who is giving higher amount of entitlements when we talk about maternity benefit compared to the PM Matru Vandana Yojana of the central government. So we find that over a period of time, definitely the two headers of rural development and food subsidy has been decreasing when we talk about the overall schemes, right? It peaked during the pandemic because the people needed the support and the government also gave the same within the same, but we see over a period of time the subsidies, the various amount of subsidies have been decreasing, and according to the various experts, this is also a very, very worrying trend. So definitely steps must be taken to increase the welfare expenditure. In the next article, we'll be talking about the Andaman Nicobar Islands and the strategic lens through which India is viewing it right now. Now, the recent and the new thrust on developing strategic infrastructure, both civilian and military on the Andaman Nicobar Islands, is decades overdue. That means the main aspect of the Andaman and Nicobar Islands and the development parameter should have been taken place in the 1980s and the 1990s, when the country is actually looking at the islands right now. And it is a very, very important fact and information for your prelims with reference to economic and social development, and for GS2 with reference to India and its neighborhood relations, and for example with respect to GS3 we have to also look at Andaman and Nicobar Islands from the lens of infrastructure. Now, when we talk about the strategic importance of the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, we have to look at this map here. When we look at this map, we find that two important places of Malacca Strait and the Krak Canal, these are located in this region, and the Krak Canal in this region. And let me tell you, more than 60 to 70% of the world's trade is directly and indirectly taking place between this entire region of the Indian Ocean. And that is why we find the Andaman Nicobar Island is located in very high amount of proximity to this particular region. And that is why it lies in India's interests, in economic interests, in military interests, in strategic interests to develop the Andaman and Nicobar Islands as a hub. Next, it is also at the juncture of four of India's international maritime zone delimitations with Myanmar, Thailand, Indonesia and Bangladesh. So definitely infrastructure must be improved in this region. Next, with reference to ocean space under United Nations Conference on the Law of Sea or UNCLOS, we find that this region is potential hotbed. That is the area surrounding the Andaman Nicobar Island is potential hotbed for various sea materials such as polymetallic nodules, sulfur nodules and various other metals. And that is why India right now, under its broader ambition of achieving blue economy, India is actually focused on developing the entire region along with Lakshadweep region for exploiting the various amount of natural resources found in this region. Next, we also see the increasing amount of Chinese interests at various choke points of the Indo-Pacific region. When we talk about choke points, we find that these choke points are the most important regions when we talk about the international trade happening through the region. So first choke point is the Malacca region, which we have seen here. Next, the Sunda, which is located in the Indonesian region. Next, the Lombok, which is located between Bali and Lombok, and also the Ambai-Weta region of the Timor Straits. And here we find that the Chinese is actually increasing its military presence in the region. And that is why India must also step its game when it is involved in the same region too. And finally, when we talk about any offense, any attack that is coming from the eastern side of the world, the Andaman Nicobar Island will be the first line of offense or first line through which India can hold up its defenses or even attack in the particular region. And for this, India has also set up the Andaman Nicobar Command, which is the integrated command forces of the armed forces of the country. Now, what should India's strategic infrastructure development in this island focus on? We have to focus on 5 things. Firstly, we have to keep the islands under surveillance because we find that recently China is also stepping up its game in the region. Next, we must be also using deterrence, be it military, be it any other kind of deterrence in the region too, especially again with reference to the Chinese threat. Thirdly, we have to build infrastructure, reliable amount of infrastructure along the southern group of islands of the Nicobar Islands. And here, because the Nicobar Islands is more close to the Southeast Asian regions, we have to strengthen the economic and political development of this region. Next, we must be also easing the travel modes to and from the mainland India. With respect to the Andaman Nicobar Islands, and this can avail a lot of amount of military supplies, civil supplies, and also the inflow and outflow of tourists in the region. And lastly, we must be reducing the islands' dependence on mainland India because we find that these islands are spread over a large amount of space and they have the resources to make them sustainable itself. But decades of non-development in this region has made them dependent on the Indian mainland, and efforts must be strengthened at reducing the same. Now, the pace of development in this region has been very slow due to again 5 factors. The first factor is that the strategic criticality has been recently acknowledged by India, particularly because Indo-Pacific region is becoming a hotbed of various political and military contestations. Next, the distance and difficulties that India has been using so far for developing the islands was so far an excuse. That means that the amount of distance from the mainland and the difficulties for developing infrastructure does not exist if India has a commitment of developing the region. Thirdly, the various complex procedures with reference to obtaining environmental clearances for forest clearances and various other development in the region have been very strict, and that is why the development has been also low. Next, the focus on Indian government on say conservation of the forest and protecting the native tribal population have also reduced the pace of development. And finally, the long-term strategic vision of developing the island, making it a global hub for infrastructure for shipping lanes and economic activity was not realized, and this was compromised at the immediate short-term political gains in the local regions. So these are the various 5 reasons why the development has been very slow. And according to the article here, there are many things what needs to be done in the Andaman Nicobar Islands as of now. Now looking at the same, we find that the very first thing that we need to do is monitor and patrol the region via aircraft and surface platforms, and this has to be properly done and properly executed by the armed forces of the nation, because we find that the region is extremely sensitive to economic trade, because the Malacca Strait is just nearby, because the Chinese vessels often incur the Indian Ocean waters. And also there must be proper amount of ports and fuel shortages and fuel refilling stations in the region, in the both northern and the southern regions. The Army, Navy, Air Force must be committing more and more forces in the Andaman Nicobar Command, because we find that the forces are not adequate with reference to the threats, the potential threats that can take place in the region. Next, the Galathea Bay, where a lot amount of turtles also nest there. We must be developing it, and a transshipment post must be expedited there to facilitate the amount of shipping infrastructure. Next, the maritime services such as repair and logistics of the various ships must be installed at the ports. Next, the road networks, the high-speed inter-island ferry services must be developed to increase and enhance the local levels people's connectivity and transport, and also to bring in more tourists. Next, the forest and environmental clearances must be also selectively made a little less stricter. Next, the planned habitation of uninhabited islands must also be taken of due consideration. And finally, India must also be leveraging international commitments when we talk about Quad and also the Indo-Pacific Oceans Initiative. So here, India must also be looking at these things. But there are some few things we also need to be considering apart from this various developments of infrastructure in the Andaman Nicobar Island. Firstly, the islands are a very sensitive, ecologically sensitive area. So any development must also be keeping in track of the local population and the local ecosystem in the region. Second, the islands are also home to lots of indigenous tribes, and lots of tribes which date back centuries old, in not even if not 1,000 years of old. So we must be also protecting them from the tourists and from the modern infrastructure. And finally, we have to understand the long-term vision when we talk about development in the region is obviously focused on the economic and military capabilities of the region, but also we must be looking at the sustainability aspects of the same too. In the next article, we'll be looking at the deemed forest, because recently Environment Ministry has released reports from 22 state governments with reference to a recent Supreme Court judgment. And this term in the news is very important with reference to UPSC prelims, particularly about environmental ecology and biodiversity and climate change, and with reference to GES 3 about conservation. Now students, to understand deemed forests, we have to look at a very important Supreme Court judgment. That is the Goda Varman judgment from 1996. Now this judgment is actually focused on the definition of forests in India. Now, according to the judgment, according to the Supreme Court, it appointed various expert committees to identify deemed forests. Now, what are deemed forests? Deemed forests are those forests which are deemed to be forests under dictionary meaning of forest, the very forest term. Right? So whatever is the dictionary definition of a forest is, that will be the main official definition for forest in the country. Now that has to be irrespective of any notification by the government, be it state or center, any recognition or any ownership status. What is there in the dictionary, that has to be the definition of a forest, and those forests are actually deemed forests. Now according to the judgment, the committee recommendations and the various advisory statements were due to be published publicly, but it never did. And in 2023, the government of India brought some amendments to the Forest Conservation Act of 1980. According to this, the government clearance was made mandatory for using any forest land for non-forest purposes, such as setting up tourist resorts and various safari activities and so on. And also it was told that in the amendment that Forest Conservation Act is applicable only on land that was notified as forest in government records. Now please note that Supreme Court in 1996 In 1996, the Supreme Court had already told that forests will be the dictionary definition of the forest, irrespective of any notification, recognition or ownership status. So, there was a group of people in the society who moved Supreme Court against this particular amendment, and that is in the Ashok Kumar Sharma versus the Union of India case. Now, in this, the Supreme Court again told the government that the states must continue to follow the dictionary definition of the forest as was highlighted in the 1996 case. And also we have to understand that all encompassing dictionary meaning will be continue to be existing in the case. And here, Environmental Ministry should be issuing a circular in this regard to the state governments with reference to the various deemed forest areas according to the dictionary definition of the forest in the states. And also in this report we find that the various state governments did not yet supply proper information with reference to the forest areas, right? Now, with reference to the Forest Survey of India, we have forest classification in the range of very dense forest, moderately dense forests, open forests and shrubs. Now, for your prelims, you have to properly look at the various categories of the forest existing in the country according to the classification given by the Forest Survey of India. In the next article, we'll be looking at the recent report released by the Ministry of Commerce with reference to the external sector data. This is very important for your prelims, that is economic and social development. Now, when we look at the data, we find that the amount of exports and imports have been reducing. Both have been reducing. See, when we compare to according to the last year, right, that is March 2023 to 2024, we find that both the imports and the exports have reduced over a period of time. It was increasing from this point of time, but again the exports have reduced slightly, but the imports have reduced by more magnitude. As you can see in this particular diagram too. Exports have reduced by around 0.6 percentages, imports have reduced by around 5.98 or around 6 percentages. And also we find that the trade deficit is now at around $15.6 billion, which is the lowest in 11 months, particularly because India's imports have reduced. That is why the trade balance has also improved over a period of time. Now, all these trends were obviously important for your prelims because they have been asking some questions related to recent trends in the economics. And here we have to understand why this decrease actually took place. Now, when we talk about lower goods exports, it was generally due to the global demand which is decreasing, particularly in the Western countries. This is the first reason. Second, there is high amount of energy prices and inflation also which is seen in the global arenas and the global nations. That is why the increasing amount of prices is decreasing the demand in India too, and also in the rest of the world too. The recent tensions in the West Asia, particularly that is taking place around the Red Sea and in the Gulf region, we find that is also one of the reasons. And finally, from India, the traditional labor-intensive sectors such as maritime products, gems, jewelries, textiles, apparels and leather experience a decline. With reference to the decline in merchandise imports with respect to exports, we find the very first reason is due to the halving of gold imports in the country and also a fall in non-oil, non-gold imports such as chemicals and so on. So they have also decreased, particularly due to the government promoting more and more import substituting industries, such as government is actually promoting the PLI scheme of increasing the amount of manufacturing with reference to chemicals in the country. So that is also leading to a decrease in the imports, and that is a very, very good news for the country. Next, we also see that the petroleum, crude and various other products have also fell by around 15%. Next, we also find that the decrease in amount of petroleum, crude oil and products fell by around 14%. Next, with reference to current account deficit, which stands for imports minus exports, we find that the imports are reducing while the exports also reduce, but the imports reduce by further more time, right? So that is why we find that the trade deficit is also at a low of around 10 to 11 months. And overall service exports have actually jumped by around 4.4% to around say $340 billion. So these are all the things that you need to know with respect to the recent trends. Finally, we'll be looking at 4 important articles for prelims. Now, the very first article is about Central Administrative Tribunal, and here, according to the Article 323 3A of the Constitution of India, it is a constitutional body and it looks into the various matters of recruitment and conditions of the service of the public servants of the country. It looks into the various complaints and the various issues with reference to ministries and departments of the central government and around other 200 organizations of the government too. It is composed of a bench of around 1 judicial member and 1 administrative member, and the conditions and the service of the chairman and the members should be equal to the judge of a high court. The salaries, allowances and the conditions of the service will be specified by the union, and the powers that it will be having is firstly with reference to the matters and the parties covered under the Administrative Tribunals Act of 1985. Next, they will be guided by the principles of natural justice and not bound by any procedure established in the or that is prescribed by the Civil Procedure Code. Next, it will be having its own rules of procedure and practice, and finally, it has the same jurisdiction and authority in respect of any contempt of itself as that of a high court in the country. In the next article, we will be looking at what is the recent term of follow-on public offer, because Vodafone Idea has recently released around 12,750 follow-on public offer. Now you know that there are many companies which are listed on the stock exchange, and they have listed on the stock exchange and released shares to raise fundings for them, and that is why we find that these are actually known as the initial public offering or IPO. That is, for the first time the company is going public in the stock markets, and when the company is trying to raise additional funds after the IPO, that is known as the follow-on public offer. That is also known as secondary offering, and that we understand that there are many types of FPOs. Firstly, dilutive FPOs, or when the number of shares increase by releasing more shares by the companies. Next, these are called non-dilutive FPOs, or when existing shareholders sell their own stocks in the markets. And finally, at the market offering, when this is actually giving the issuing company the ability to raise capital as needed. In the next article, we will be looking at what is a windfall tax, because recently the government has raised windfall tax on petroleum crude. And with reference to windfall tax, first let us understand what is windfall profit. Now, windfall profits refers to sudden increase in profits. The causes can be price hikes, supply shortages, executive order from the government, court ruling, dramatic shift in trade policy. All the factors which increase the profits of the company by actually reducing the supply in the market or increasing the demand in the market in this time. All these causes actually refer to the either reduction in supply of the commodity or increasing in the demand of the commodity via various shocks in the economy. And when we find that the companies are having more and more profits with reference to windfall profits, the government must be taxing a part of the excess profits. That is known as the windfall tax, which is a tax levied by the governments against certain industries when economic conditions allow those industries to experience significantly above average profits. And please note that windfall taxes are not permanent in nature. They are temporary in natures, because windfall taxes will be gone when the windfall profits will be gone. When the windfall profits will be gone, they will be gone when these causes have normalized. And finally, we will be concluding the session with wholesale price index. Now, wholesale price index is representing the prices of goods at a wholesale stage. It is released by the Office of Economic Advisor under the Ministry of Commerce and Industry. It is consisting of around 700 items, consisting from the various subdivisions of manufactured products, fuel and power, and primary articles. The base year of WPI is 2011 and 12. Now, with reference to recent WPI index, we find that the WPI inflation has actually increased by around 0.53 percentages, and with reference to all commodities, the wholesale inflation has increased. The same is seen in the primary articles, but fuel and power inflation has reduced, and also the same has happened in the manufacturing products. Now, I thank you all for being a very patient audience. Please do follow the quiz which is coming up. All the best and best of luck for your future endeavors till we meet again. Thank you.